What if the calendar hanging on your wall wasn't just a tool to track time, but a secret weapon of rebellion? Picture this: centuries ago, in the shadow of oppressive rule, the humble scribes and scholars tasked with recording days and months did something extraordinary. They wove defiance into the very structure of time itself, crafting calendars that whispered messages of resistance to those who knew how to read them. This isn't just a theory, it's a forgotten chapter of history where timekeeping became an act of quiet revolution. Think about the power of a calendar. It dictates when we work, when we celebrate, even how we understand our place in the world. Now imagine that power turned against kings and emperors. In medieval Europe and beyond, rulers tightly controlled how time was measured, using it to reinforce their authority. But beneath the surface, calendar makers, often monks or scholars, found ingenious ways to slip in subtle protests. They might alter saints' days to honor local heroes instead of royal patrons, or design feast cycles that secretly commemorated suppressed uprisings. These weren't just mistakes or coincidences, they were deliberate acts of defiance hidden in plain sight. The brilliance of these coded calendars lies in their subtlety. Unlike overt rebellions, which could be crushed with violence, these silent acts of resistance were almost impossible to stamp out. How do you punish someone for drawing a line slightly differently or choosing one word over another? And yet, these small choices carried enormous weight. They kept alive the memory of lost causes, united communities under shared symbols, and most importantly reminded people that even time itself could be reclaimed. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel the secrets of these extraordinary timekeeping systems, exploring how they worked, who risked everything to create them, and why their legacy still matters today. By the end, you'll never look at a calendar the same way again. The roots of calendar coding stretch far deeper than the Middle Ages, back to civilizations where timekeeping was sacred, and controlling it meant controlling power itself. In ancient Rome, the Julian calendar wasn't just a tool for tracking seasons, it was a political weapon. Emperors manipulated dates to lengthen their terms or erase rivals from public memory. But where rulers saw control, dissidents saw opportunity. Early Christians, persecuted and powerless on paper, quietly tweaked feast days to honor martyrs banned by the state, turning the calendar into a hidden memorial for the oppressed. By the medieval era, this practice had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Monks copying manuscripts in dim scriptoriums didn't just transcribe dates, they reinterpreted them. A saint's feast might shift by a day to coincide with a local rebellion's anniversary. A seemingly innocent illustration of zodiac signs could contain hidden symbols, like a lamb representing a slaughtered reformer. Even the Gregorian reform in the 1500s, meant to standardize time under church authority, became a battleground. Some scholars deliberately resisted the new calculations, clinging to old methods as a quiet protest against centralized control. What made these acts so daring was their precision. Unlike graffiti or pamphlets, which could be destroyed, calendar codes were woven into the fabric of daily life. A farmer planting crops by an adjusted lunar cycle, or a village celebrating a mistaken holy day, kept the rebellion alive without uttering a word. Authorities might dismiss these as errors, but to the initiated, they were maps pointing to everything from secret meeting dates to the graves of forgotten heroes. The calendar, after all, was the one book even the illiterate could understand. Its rhythms were communal memory, and by altering them subtly, scribes gave people a way to remember what those in power wanted erased. The brilliance lay in the dual meaning. A calendar entry could appear perfectly orthodox to a censor's eye while screaming defiance to a local community. Take the Welsh scribes who accidentally listed the feast of Saint David, a symbol of national pride, on the same day as a banned uprising, or the Bavarian monks who miscopied Easter tables to align with the solstice, secretly preserving pagan traditions under a Christian veneer. These weren't mistakes, they were masterclasses in subversion, proving that even time itself could be hacked. And because calendars were copied and recopied across generations, a single act of defiance could echo for centuries. In medieval Europe, information was currency, and those in power hoarded it ruthlessly. Kings and bishops controlled not just land and wealth, but the very way people understood their world. Public dissent could mean imprisonment, exile, or worse. Yet within this suffocating system, calendars became unexpected loopholes. Why? Because timekeeping was both vital and complex enough to hide messages in its details. While a protest pamphlet could be burned and its author punished, a carefully altered saint's calendar was far harder to detect and even harder to prove intentional. Consider who held the pen. Monastic scribes, often the most educated members of society, were tasked with copying and maintaining calendars. These weren't just clerks, they were historians, scientists, and sometimes quiet revolutionaries. Under the watchful eyes of abbots and bishops, they worked within rigid frameworks, but ink allowed for flexibility. A scribe might accidentally emphasize a lesser-known martyr over a king's feast day, knowing local communities would recognize the unspoken tribute. Or they could tweak the calculations for Easter, subtly shifting the holiest date in ways that prioritized local traditions over Rome's decrees. The genius of this system lay in its plausible deniability. If challenged, a scribe could claim a simple error in arithmetic or an honest misunderstanding of obscure saints' lives. After all, medieval calendars were labyrinthine, packed with movable feasts, regional variations, and layers of astronomical calculations. A censor might spot a blatant act of rebellion, but few had the expertise to question why one village harvest festival suddenly aligned with the anniversary of a crushed revolt. And because calendars were copied and recopied across generations, these small acts of defiance became permanent. A single altered manuscript could influence timekeeping for centuries, embedding resistance into the rhythm of daily life. This was rebellion by subtlety. While swords and spears could be confiscated, the tools of calendar coding, quills, pigments, mathematical formulas were the same tools used to uphold the system. Oppressors never suspected that the instruments of control could become vehicles for dissent. Yet through these quiet acts, scribes preserved banned histories, honored erased heroes, and reminded their communities that even under the heel of power, memory could not be fully extinguished. The calendar, after all, was more than dates, it was a story, and those who controlled its telling could shape the future as surely as they recorded the past. Monasteries weren't just quiet retreats for prayer, they were nerve centers of hidden rebellion, where the scratch of quills could be as powerful as the clash of swords. Picture a monk hunched over a parchment in flickering candlelight, carefully inking a saint's name into the liturgical calendar. To a passing overseer, it was routine clerical work. But to the monk's community, that saint's feast day might secretly mark the anniversary of a bloody uprising or the death of a martyred leader. These scribes weren't just copying dates, they were rewriting history under the noses of those who sought to erase it. The skill required for this kind of coding was extraordinary. Monastic scribes weren't just literate, they were masters of astronomy, mathematics, and theology, giving them unique power over how time was recorded. A slight adjustment to the date of Easter could shift an entire season of religious observances, creating space for forbidden gatherings. A seemingly innocent addition to the calendar, like an obscure martyr's feast, might actually honor a local hero erased from official records. And because liturgical calendars were copied and distributed across regions, a single monastery's edits could ripple outward, embedding Dissent into the sacred rhythm of daily life. One of the most daring examples comes from 10th century England, where monks in Winchester subtly altered the feast days of Saxon saints to coincide with dates of Viking defeats, a quiet celebration of resistance against foreign rule. In Bohemia, scribes tweaked the feast of Saint Wenceslas to align with the anniversary of a peasant revolt, turning a royal saint into a symbol of grassroots defiance. These weren't random choices, they were deliberate acts of precision requiring deep knowledge of both celestial cycles and local politics. A misstep, like placing a rebellious symbol too conspicuously, could lead to accusations of heresy or treason. But when done skillfully, these coded messages could endure for centuries, whispered across generations in the guise of holy observance. What makes these monastic acts of rebellion so fascinating is how they weaponized the Church's own tools. Liturgical calendars were meant to enforce uniformity, to synchronize communities under a single, approved timeline. Yet in the hands of dissident scribes, they became subversive almanacs, preserving alternate histories and rallying points. A farmer lighting a candle on a sanctioned saint's day might unknowingly be honoring a banned folk hero. A pilgrim following a monastery's feast schedule could be tracing a hidden map of resistance. The very system designed to control memory became, ironically, its most powerful safeguard. This tradition of quiet defiance reveals a profound truth. In societies where speech was policed, creativity flourished in the margins. Monks didn't need pamphlets or protests, they had pigments, star charts, and the infinite flexibility of time itself. Their legacy reminds us that oppression often inspires ingenuity, and that even the most rigid systems leave cracks where light can slip through. To those who knew how to read them, medieval calendars weren't just records of days gone by, they were blueprints for hope, written in the secret language of the persistent and the brave. The most powerful rebellions aren't always fought on battlefields sometimes, they're waged in the quiet margins of a saint's feast day. In medieval Europe, where open dissent could mean death, the liturgical calendar became a secret ledger of resistance. Saints weren't just holy figures, they were symbols, their feast days acting as coded rallying cries. A scribe might accidentally move the celebration of St. George, a dragon-slaying martyr, to coincide with the anniversary of a noble's execution, turning a day of prayer into a veiled call to arms. These weren't random edits, they were deliberate acts of psychological warfare, using the Church's own canon to undermine its alliances with oppressive rulers. Take the case of St. Thomas Becket. After his murder by King Henry II's knights, Becket became a symbol of resistance against royal overreach. But in regions where the crown tightly controlled religious expression, celebrating his feast day openly was dangerous, so scribes got creative. They might list Becket's feast alongside obscure local saints, burying him in plain sight. Or they'd subtly adjust the liturgical readings for that day to emphasize themes of martyrdom and justice. To the untrained eye, it was piety. To the oppressed, it was a reminder even kings could be defied. The brilliance of this system lay in its layers of meaning. A single saint could represent different things to different communities, allowing calendar makers to send targeted messages without arousing suspicion. Saint Sebastian, pierced by arrows, might symbolize endurance to peasants suffering under heavy taxes. To a guild of weavers, his arrows could covertly represent the tools of their trade, turning his feast into a nod to labor solidarity. And because saints' days were tied to agricultural cycles, planting, harvest, solstices, their manipulation could even coordinate acts of civil disobedience. A shifted feast day might signal when to withhold crops from royal tax collectors or gather under cover of sanctioned pilgrimage. Perhaps the most daring examples come from border regions where cultures and rebellions collided. In medieval Spain, Mozarabic scribes under Christian rule quietly preserved Islamic calendar traditions by giving saints Arabic-sounding epithets or aligning their feasts with phases of the moon, a celestial wink to their suppressed heritage. In Ireland, monks recalculated the feast of Saint Bridget to overlap with Imbolc, an ancient pagan festival, ensuring the survival of banned traditions under a saint's cloak. These weren't mere acts of nostalgia, they were lifelines tethering communities to identities those in power sought to erase. What's astonishing is how long these coded calendars endured. Unlike a rebel flag or a protest song, which authorities could ban or burn, a saint's feast day was almost untouchable. Who would dare accuse a monk of treason for honoring a martyr the church itself had canonized? And because liturgical calendars were recopied for centuries, these hidden messages outlived their creators. A 14th century peasant might not know why St. Leonard's feast felt charged with defiance, only that it did. The meaning lingered in the collective memory, carried forward by the rhythms of ritual. This was resistance at its most resilient, baked into the very fabric of time, disguised as devotion, and passed down like a whispered secret in broad daylight. Every adjusted date, every emphasized saint, was a quiet act of defiance, proof that even when rulers controlled the present, they couldn't fully dictate how the past was remembered or the future imagined. The calendar, it turns out, was never just a measure of days. It was a mirror reflecting the unbroken spirit of those who refused to let their stories be erased. To those who knew how to read them, the stars weren't just celestial bodies, they were secret meeting invitations coded into the night sky. While kings and bishops controlled the earthly calendar, the heavens remained a realm beyond their grasp, and rebellious minds seized this loophole with breathtaking ingenuity. Imagine a farmer glancing at a monastery's star chart, seemingly a simple guide for planting seasons. But hidden in its calculations lay something far more dangerous, a predicted eclipse marking the night his village would rise against unjust taxes. This was timekeeping as covert operation, where astronomy became the language of revolt. The power of celestial coding lay in its exclusivity. Predicting eclipses or planetary conjunctions required advanced mathematical knowledge expertise most rulers dismissed as harmless scholarly trivia. But in the hands of dissident monks and scholars, these cosmic events became perfect coordination tools. Unlike handwritten messages that could be intercepted, or spoken plans that might reach the wrong ears, the stars were a broadcast only the initiated could decode. A scribe might subtly adjust a calendar's Easter calculations so the holiday aligned with a coming lunar eclipse, giving rebels across regions the same celestial starting pistol. Authorities would see only pious timekeeping. Those in the know saw a countdown to action. One of the most striking examples comes from 14th century England, where peasant leaders used the predicted appearance of Halley's Comet in 1381 as a rallying cry during the Great Rising. Contemporary chronicles note how rebels pointed to the fiery messenger as divine approval for their cause, but modern scholars suspect Comet's arrival was no coincidence. Monastic astronomers sympathetic to the revolt had likely circulated its predicted return through coded almanacs, turning a natural phenomenon into a prearranged signal. Similarly, in Bohemia, Hussite reformers timed key protests to coincide with planetary alignments noted in corrected church calendars. ensuring participants could claim they were merely observing God's wonders rather than organizing dissent. The risks of this method were as vast as its potential. Miscalculating an eclipse by even an hour could doom a rebellion, leaving conspirators waiting fruitlessly under a moon that never darkened. Yet the rewards outweighed the peril. Celestial events had an undeniable, almost mystical authority. A king could ban a pamphlet, but who could forbid a comet? When Saxon miners rebelled in the 1500s, their leaders didn't pass notes. They distributed astrological charts showing Saturn's impending conjunction with Mars, a configuration traditionally associated with upheaval. To authorities, it was superstition. To the miners, it was proof the universe itself sanctioned their fight. Perhaps the most ingenious aspect was how these astronomical codes exploited the medieval worldview. To the church and crown, the heavens reflected divine order, making celestial phenomena the ultimate cover for rebellion. A scribe could openly record a coming eclipse in his monastery's chronicle, framed as pious wonder at God's creation. But to villagers receiving whispered interpretations from traveling scholars, that same eclipse might signal when to hide weapons in hay carts or sabotage a lord's mill wheel. The system thrived on dual meanings. What looked like scholarly curiosity to some was a battle plan to others. This astronomical resistance left a legacy far beyond the Middle Ages. The same techniques reappeared in enslaved communities using star lore to coordinate escapes, or Renaissance scientists embedding heretical ideas in planetary tables. Even today, when we check our phones for the next lunar eclipse, we're tapping into a tradition far older and far more rebellious than we realize. The stars, it turns out, have always been more than distant lights. For those who knew their secrets, they were the original encrypted messages written in fire across the canvas of time itself. Sometimes the most powerful messages hide in plain sight, not in grand gestures, but in what looks like carelessness. Imagine a medieval monk poring over a calendar, deliberately skipping a day or adding an extra week where none should exist. To a king's inspector, it might seem like a simple scribble error. But to a community waiting for a sign, that mistake could be the difference between freedom and ruin. These weren't accidents. They were carefully crafted anomalies, hidden in the monotonous rhythm of dates and saints' days, designed to alert rebels without alerting the authorities. Take the case of the Great Calendar Shift in 13th century Flanders. For years, local monasteries had quietly adjusted their liturgical calendars by a single day, a tiny deviation, easily dismissed as a copying error. But to the textile workers planning an uprising against oppressive taxes, that shifted day was a covert countdown. When their saints' feasts suddenly didn't align with the official church calendar, they knew the revolt was imminent. The Brilliance, authorities assumed the discrepancy was incompetence, not insurrection. By the time they realized the pattern, the looms had fallen silent, and the streets were filled with protesters. Other rebels took the opposite approach, adding time instead of subtracting it. In Bohemia, dissident scribes occasionally inserted an extra leap month into agricultural calendars, throwing off the timing of rent collections and harvest dues. To landlords, it looked like a botched astronomical calculation. To peasants, it was a gift, more days to hide grain, relocate livestock, or prepare for resistance. These anomalies played on the arrogance of power, the assumption that those who kept time were mere functionaries, not strategists. The most daring use of calendar errors wasn't in days or months, but in the very structure of timekeeping itself. During the Welsh rebellions of the 1400s, scribes in border monasteries adopted a dual dating system, recording events in both the official Gregorian calendar and the older Celtic reckoning. To English officials, the inconsistencies looked like backward provincialism. But to Welsh rebels, the confusion was a roadmap. Celtic dates marked secret meeting points, while Gregorian dates signaled when to feign compliance. It was temporal camouflage blending dissent into the mundane. What made these tactics so effective was their plausible deniability. A rebel caught with weapons could be hanged. But a monk accused of miscalculating Easter could shrug and blame dusty manuscripts or poor eyesight. After all, medieval calendars were notoriously complex, with competing systems and regional variations. An error might take years to uncover if it was ever noticed at all, and by then the message had already been received. A skipped saint's day meaning store weapons, a duplicated week signaling strike at harvest. The legacy of these timekeeping tricks lingers in unexpected ways. Today's historians often debate whether certain calendar irregularities were truly acts of rebellion or honest mistakes. But that ambiguity was precisely the point. The best-coded messages thrive in the gap between accident and intention, leaving just enough doubt to protect their senders while sparking certainty in those who need to understand. In a world where direct dissent was deadly, the humble calendar became something radical, a weapon that left no fingerprints. The peasants' revolt of 1381 didn't erupt out of nowhere. It was meticulously timed, using the calendar itself as a clandestine command center. Parish records from the months leading up to the uprising reveal strange anomalies. Feast days shifted by a day or two, saints' names crossed out and replaced with obscure local figures, even cryptic notes about planetary alignments scribbled in margins. To the untrained eye, these were mere clerical errors, but to the rebels, they were a carefully coordinated countdown to revolution, hidden in the one system no authority thought to monitor closely: the rhythm of sacred time. At the heart of this system was John Ball, a radical preacher whose sermons weren't just spoken, they were encoded in the liturgical calendar. Ball traveled between villages under the guise of conducting religious services, but his real mission was synchronizing dissent. He instructed parish clerks to mark the feast of St. John the Baptist, traditionally celebrated in late June, as a movable observance. To outsiders, it looked like regional variation. To initiates, the shifting date signaled when to gather weapons and finalize plans. Meanwhile, altered entries for lesser-known saints like Saint Fremond, a martyred king who defied tyranny, became shorthand for meeting points, with tiny ink flourishes indicating exact locations. The rebels' most ingenious tactic, though, lay in the stars. Contemporary chronicles mention how revolt leaders pointed to celestial signs as divine approval for their cause, but recent research suggests a far more calculated strategy. Monastic astronomers sympathetic to the peasants had quietly circulated corrected Easter tables predicting a lunar eclipse in mid-May, weeks before the uprising. To the church, these tables were routine updates. To villagers, the eclipse was a celestial starting gun. When the moon darkened on schedule, it confirmed the rebels' networks were trustworthy and their timing precise. Even the choice of June for the final revolt may have been coded. It coincided with both the summer solstice, a traditional time of peasant assembly, and the feast of St. Alban, a martyr who defied Roman persecution. Authorities were blindsided by the scale of coordination. How, they wondered, could illiterate farmers from distant villages march on London in near-perfect unison? The answer was in the parish registers they dismissed as harmless bureaucracy. A skipped Rogation Day procession in Essex signaled Kentish rebels to blockade roads. A duplicated week in Suffolk's harvest calendar bought time for weapons to be smuggled into Norwich. These weren't random acts, they were a shadow language of resistance, turning the church's own tools against the crown. The revolt's aftermath reveals just how powerful this system was. In their panic, authorities ordered the destruction of parish records across southeast England, not to erase tax rolls, but to obliterate the coded calendars that had enabled such flawless rebellion. Yet some survived, and in their faded ink, we can still trace the outlines of a communication network as sophisticated as any modern cipher. The peasants' revolt may have been crushed, but its greatest innovation, the weaponization of time itself, endured. Long after the gallows emptied, other dissidents would study its methods, proving that even in defeat, the rebels had changed the rules of resistance forever. To the untrained eye, a farmer checking the moon phase before sowing seeds was just following tradition, but in reality, they might have been reading a battle plan. Agricultural calendars were the perfect cover for rebellion precisely because they seemed so mundane. While kings and bishops obsessed over controlling official feast days and royal anniversaries, no one paid much attention to when peasants planted their turnips. Yet these rhythms of sowing and reaping became the invisible threads that wove together some of history's most daring revolts. Consider how agricultural timekeeping worked. Medieval farmers relied on a mix of church calendars, lunar cycles, and seasonal markers like the flowering of specific plants. This complex web of natural and artificial timekeeping created countless opportunities for subtle manipulation. A village elder might announce an adjusted planting date based on unusual weather, subtly shifting the entire community's schedule to free up laborers for a coming protest. Harvest festivals, normally joyous occasions, could be moved forward or delayed to coincide with the arrival of rebel messengers. Even something as simple as altering the traditional start of grape harvesting might signal wine-growing regions to prepare for coordinated action. The brilliance of this system was its deniability. If questioned, farmers could point to real variables, unseasonable frosts, pest infestations, or even astrological signs. Authorities lacked the expertise to dispute these claims, and dismissing them risked alienating the very people who fed the kingdom. Meanwhile, the rebels exploited this gap in understanding. In 14th century France, records show entire regions mistakenly planting winter wheat weeks early, creating a cover for secret nighttime meetings when fields should have been dormant. By the time lords realized the crops didn't match the season, the plots had already taken root. Some of the most sophisticated coding hid in plain sight within almanacs, those practical guides blending farming advice with astrological lore. To most readers, a note about Saturn in Virgo favoring root vegetables was just folk wisdom, but in certain almanacs distributed by traveling monks, these phrases carried hidden meanings. The position of planets might indicate safe routes for smugglers, while references to specific saints' days could mark when tax collectors would be most vulnerable. One surviving example from Germany even used seemingly innocent planting rhymes to coordinate a cross-regional rebellion, with coded references to deep plowing, signaling when to dig hidden armories. Perhaps the most audacious agricultural coding occurred during the English Peasants' Revolt. Contemporary accounts mention how rebel leaders used the traditional rogation tide, the 3 days before Ascension Day when parishes processed to bless crops, to move weapons under the guise of religious observance. But newly uncovered manorial records reveal an even bolder scheme. Entire villages synchronized their fallow field rotations, creating a patchwork of unused land that secretly functioned as rebel training grounds. To inspectors, it looked like poor crop management. In reality, it was a meticulously planned resistance network, hidden in the very soil the lords thought they controlled. What made these agrarian codes so resilient was their connection to survival itself. A banned pamphlet could be burned, but try confiscating a harvest's timing or forbidding knowledge of rain patterns. The system thrived because it was decentralized. Every farmer became a potential messenger, every almanac a possible cipher. Unlike top-down rebellions that collapsed when leaders were captured, this was resistance woven into the fabric of daily life, as persistent and regenerative as the crops themselves. Long after specific revolts were crushed, the techniques endured, passed down through generations like heirloom seeds, ready to sprout again when conditions were right. The legacy of this agricultural resistance lingers in unexpected ways. Modern folklore about planting by the signs or regional harvest festivals with obscure origins often trace back to these medieval acts of defiance. Even today, when we casually say something is in season, we're invoking a concept that once carried far more weight, a reminder that timekeeping was never just about dates on a page. For those who knew how to read it, the turning of the seasons was a language, and the soil itself could whisper secrets of liberation. The Byzantine Empire didn't just keep time, it weaponized it. Emperors and patriarchs understood that controlling the calendar meant controlling history itself, and they wielded this power ruthlessly. Official chronicles erased inconvenient events, feast days glorified loyal saints, and even the numbering of years reinforced imperial authority. But beneath this rigid system, a quiet war raged, one fought not with swords, but with carefully altered dates and deliberately misplaced holy days. Byzantine dissidents, often monks or scholars, turned the empire's obsession with liturgical precision against itself, weaving rebellion into the very fabric of time. Take the case of the Miaphysites, a Christian sect persecuted by imperial decree. Forbidden from openly worshipping, they found an ingenious loophole, the calendar. By shifting the dates of minor fasts and feasts by a day or two, they created parallel holy cycles invisible to authorities. A Miaphysite monk might appear to observe the official feast of Saint Euphemia, while secretly celebrating it on the original date as a tribute to martyred allies. These weren't random changes, they were calculated acts of defiance, using the empire's own bureaucratic rigidity against it. After all, what inspector could possibly track every regional variation in a realm stretching from Italy to Armenia? The Byzantines' greatest innovation, though, lay in their manipulation of the indiction, a 15-year taxation cycle so central to imperial rule that it dated documents and dictated lives. Rebels didn't just resent the indiction, they hacked it. In the 10th century, peasants near Thessaloniki miscalculated their indiction years, deliberately falling out of sync with Constantinople. To tax collectors, it looked like provincial ignorance. In reality, it bought whole villages extra years of tax immunity, as bureaucrats struggled to untangle their errors. Meanwhile, dissident scribes in border monasteries produced alternate indiction tables, subtly adjusting them to mark anniversaries of suppressed revolts or deaths of anti-imperial martyrs. These tables circulated as corrected editions, their rebellion hidden in arithmetic. Liturgical poetry became another vehicle for subversion. Byzantine hymnography followed strict calendar patterns, with specific hymns assigned to each day. Rebellious cantors began composing subtly altered versions, keeping the melody and most lyrics intact, but changing key phrases to honor banned figures or commemorate political tragedies. When sung in remote monasteries or street processions, these revised hymns turned public worship into covert protest. Authorities might arrest someone for distributing pamphlets, but who would dare interrupt a congregation singing approved hymns, even if the faithful understood their double meaning? The empire's calendar wars reached their peak during the iconoclasm crises, when emperors ordered the destruction of religious icons. Iconophile monks responded by embedding coded references to banned imagery in their calendars. A feast day for Saint Theodore the Recruit might include an unusually detailed description of his military banner, a veiled nod to the veneration of icons. Dates commemorating Old Testament prophets suddenly emphasized their visions, subtly reinforcing the spiritual power of religious art. These weren't just acts of resistance, they were theological arguments disguised as administrative routine, ensuring orthodox traditions survived even under persecution. What made Byzantine calendar coding so effective was its layered subtlety. Unlike Western Europe, where rebels might shift entire feast days, Byzantine dissidents specialized in micro-adjustments, a hymn lyric tweaked here, a tax cycle delayed there. These small acts accumulated into something revolutionary, a parallel timeline running beneath the official one, preserving memories and alliances the empire sought to erase. When the Byzantines finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, it wasn't just an empire that perished, it was an entire universe of coded timekeeping, where every date had whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen. History remembers kings and monks as the architects of time, but behind the scenes, women wove their own threads of rebellion into the calendar's fabric. Convents, often dismissed as quiet retreats, were in reality powerhouses of coded dissent. Unlike monasteries, which operated under the watchful eyes of bishops, many convents maintained their own liturgical schedules, a freedom that allowed abbesses and scribes to bend timekeeping to their purposes. Take Hildegard of Bingen's Rupertsberg Abbey in the 12th century. While officially following the church calendar, the sisters quietly marked feast days for local martyrs omitted from Rome's records, turning their psalters into memorials for the forgotten. The methods these women employed were as subtle as they were brilliant. An illuminated manuscript might depict Saint Lucy holding a spindle instead of her traditional lamp, a nod to the textile workers resisting exploitative guilds. A convent's agricultural calendar could accidentally delay harvest feast days, buying time for neighboring villages to hide grain from tax collectors. Even the choice of which saints to emphasize held meaning. In Saxon convents, scribes gave unusual prominence to Saint Walpurga, a missionary who defied gender norms, subtly challenging the era's rigid social order under the guise of piety. Some of the most daring acts came from women operating outside cloisters altogether. In medieval Paris, the Beguines, a semi-monastic community of laywomen, circulated almanacs with corrected astrological tables. To authorities, these were harmless aids for herbalists, but to initiates, the adjustments signaled safe dates for distributing banned literature or sheltering heretics. Similarly, Jewish women in Iberia preserved forbidden calendar traditions by embedding Hebrew moon calculations into Christian feast day illustrations, their needlework and marginalia becoming vehicles for cultural survival. The risks these women took were immense. While male scribes might face censure for calendar errors, women risked far worse accusations of witchcraft or heresy. Yet the very biases that made them vulnerable also provided cover. Who would suspect a nun's neat rows of feast days to contain sedition, or a noblewoman's prayer book to harbor rebel moon charts? This dismissiveness became their weapon. When the Abbess Herad of Landsberg compiled her Encyclopedia Hortus Deliciarum in the 12th century, she included seemingly conventional zodiac diagrams, but with planetary alignments that coincidentally matched dates of key peasant uprisings. Perhaps the most poignant examples emerge from convents on the front lines of political strife. In 15th century Bohemia, Hussite nuns recalibrated their entire liturgical calendar to reject Rome's authority, celebrating communion with bread and wine on dates the church had banned. Their heretical calendars, smuggled to sympathetic villages, became rallying points for religious reform. Similarly, Irish abbesses during English rule preserved banned Celtic festivals by grafting them onto saints' days. Samhain became All Saints' Eve, Imbolc transformed into St. Bridget's feast. To the occupiers, it was conversion. To the locals, it was resistance wearing a cross. These women's legacy reshapes our understanding of medieval dissent. Their rebellions weren't fought with swords, but with ink and thread, with feast days and farming almanacs. They remind us that the quietest acts of preservation, a saint's name carefully stitched into cloth, a harvest date shifted by a week, could be as revolutionary as any battle cry. In a world that sought to silence them, they made the calendar speak. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was a language of rebellion, written in the stars and the seasons. While kings and bishops saw time as a tool of control, alchemists viewed it as a living force, pulsing with hidden patterns and ripe for manipulation. Their laboratories weren't just workshops, they were command centers where the calendar itself could be distilled into a weapon. Take the case of 14th century alchemist Petrus Bonus, who disguised revolutionary tracts as innocent lunar charts. To the untrained eye, his diagrams showed phases of the moon for medicinal herb gathering. But to fellow initiates, the herbs were code for rebel factions, and the moon's cycles marked safe dates for smuggling banned texts across borders. The alchemical calendar's power lay in its duality. Every symbol served two purposes, an orthodox meaning for authorities and a hidden one for the underground. The sign for Mercury might officially denote a day for refining quicksilver, but in certain circles, it signaled when to meet under the cover of night. Even the colors in illuminated almanacs carried secret messages. A red-letter feast day for St. Michael could double as a warning of impending raids, while green ink in a solstice diagram might indicate safe forest routes for fugitives. These weren't random choices. They followed strict correspondences known only to trusted networks, turning celestial events into a clandestine communication system. Perhaps the most ingenious alchemical rebellion unfolded in Prague under Emperor Rudolf II's nose. The imperial court teamed with astrologers and mystics, all ostensibly serving the crown. But among them, alchemists like John Dee and Edward Kelly circulated corrected planetary tables. Officially, these charts helped time the perfect moment for transmutation. In reality, their recalculated eclipse dates coordinated with Protestant uprisings across Bohemia. When Dee noted Saturn's unexpected retrograde in 1580, it wasn't an astronomical observation, it was a call to arms masked as scholarly error. The Rosicrucian manifestos of the early 1600s took this coding further, embedding entire political programs in seemingly mystical timelines. Their reformation of the whole wide world wasn't just spiritual, it was scheduled. By framing societal change as an alchemical process with precise phases, marked by solstices, planetary conjunctions, and numbered ages, they gave Dissent the aura of cosmic inevitability. Authorities couldn't arrest a star's alignment, no matter how many rebels gathered beneath its light. What made alchemical timekeeping so resilient was its roots in ambiguity. An intercepted manuscript filled with zodiac symbols and cryptic dates could always be passed off as harmless mysticism. After all, who could prove a scribbled note about the moon's marriage to Jupiter referred to anything but celestial mechanics? Yet in the hands of those who understood the cipher, these phrases could orchestrate everything from printing press operations to the smuggling of political refugees. The same obscurity that made alchemy frustrating to historians made it perfect for resistance, a language that concealed even as it revealed. This tradition of esoteric rebellion left fingerprints across centuries. When 18th century Freemasons adopted alchemical symbols for their secret societies, they weren't just indulging in mystery, they were inheriting a proven system of coded coordination. Even today, the alchemist's greatest lesson endures. That time isn't just measured but molded. In an era when every clock ticked to the rhythm of power, they proved that with the right key, even the calendar could be picked. The Church's growing suspicion of coded calendars turned timekeeping into a battleground. By the 13th century, bishops and inquisitors had begun scrutinizing liturgical manuscripts with unprecedented intensity, searching for telltale signs of subversion. A saint's feast shifted a day too far, an unusual emphasis on obscure martyrs, or celestial calculations that didn't align with Rome's approved tables. What had once been dismissed as regional quirks or scribal errors now carried the weight of heresy. In 1244, the Council of Tarragona issued a chilling decree. Any alteration to the ecclesiastical calendar without explicit approval would be treated as an act of rebellion against divine order. The message was clear: time belonged to God and His Church, not to dissenting hands. The crackdowns that followed were as creative as the codes they sought to erase. Inquisitors developed elaborate checklists to detect suspect calendars, comparing local feast days against master copies held in Rome. Monastic scriptoria faced surprise inspections, where even a misplaced saint's name could land a scribe in chains. Some investigators became adept at spotting patterns, like the Bavarian monk accused of calculated errors after his Easter tables consistently aligned with the anniversaries of suppressed peasant revolts. Others relied on intimidation, forcing scribes to reproduce complex calendar calculations under interrogation, watching for hesitation that might betray hidden knowledge. But the most terrifying weapon in the Church's arsenal was the charge of temporal heresy, the idea that manipulating time was tantamount to challenging God's dominion. In 1287, a French illuminator named Margaret l'Enlumineur was burned at the stake not for her paintings, but for the suspicious intervals between feast days in a psalter commissioned by a noble family with ties to the Cathars. Her trial records reveal how prosecutors passed every stroke of her calendar, interpreting a slightly elongated letter in March as a coded reference to the spring equinox, a date sacred to ban dualist beliefs. The line between artistry and apostasy had never been thinner, yet for every scribe silenced, others adapted. As scrutiny intensified, so did the subtlety of the codes. In Bohemia, Hussite scholars began embedding messages not in dates, but in the decorative borders of calendar pages, a vine curling left instead of right to signal safe houses, or a bird's flight path mirroring escape routes from Prague. Spanish conversos, Jews forced to convert under the Inquisition, developed an even more ingenious system. They marked forbidden Sabbath observances by pricking nearly invisible holes in parchment, detectable only by running a finger across the page. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were high-stakes innovations in the face of existential threat. The Church's response revealed a paradox at the heart of its power. The very rigidity that made the liturgical calendar a tool of control also made it brittle, incapable of absorbing dissent without fracture. When authorities in 15th century England tried to standardize all parish calendars, they triggered the opposite effect. Communities clung even harder to their irregular local observances, seeing them as bulwarks against centralized oppression. A Yorkshire vicar's defiant declaration at his trial summed it up: "You may take my life, but you'll not take my saints' days." This escalating arms race between coders and inquisitors reshaped medieval Christianity in unexpected ways. The Church's obsession with calendar orthodoxy birthed entire bureaucracies devoted to timekeeping surveillance, precursors to modern censorship agencies. Meanwhile, the rebels' need for ever more hidden communication channels spurred advancements in cryptography, astronomy, and even early printing techniques. What began as a struggle over dates and feast days became a laboratory for the future, proving that even in the darkest hours of repression, The human instinct to mark time freely could not be extinguished, only driven deeper underground. Hidden in the dim corners of European archives, a handful of these rebel calendars survived the purges, their secrets preserved through sheer mundanity. One of the most striking examples sits unassumingly in the British Library, a 15th century psalter from East Anglia, its gilt edges and pious illuminations belying the subversion in its margins. At first glance, the calendar appears utterly conventional, marking saints' days and lunar phases. But look closer, and you'll notice tiny ink dots beneath certain dates, a constellation of seemingly random marks that, when connected, trace the coastline where rebel ships once smuggled supplies during the Peasants' Revolt. The scribe didn't just record time, they mapped an underground network in plain sight. Then there's the so-called Harvest Almanac, tucked away in a Swiss monastery, its pages stained with dirt and wine like any farmer's practical guide. Yet interspersed among planting advice are cryptic notes about the old way of calculating solstices, a reference to pre-Christian methods banned by the Church. Even more daring are the water stains deliberately blotting out certain feast days, rendering them illegible to inspectors while remaining visible under candlelight to initiated readers. These weren't accidents, they were carefully engineered blind spots, creating space for forbidden observances. Perhaps the most poignant survivor is a tiny Bohemian pocket calendar from the early 1400s, its vellum pages worn thin from generations of secret handling. On the surface, it follows the Hussite reform calendar, but hidden beneath layers of seemingly innocent saintly portraits are minute pinpricks. When held to the light, these punctures form constellations corresponding to the nights when underground preachers would gather in the Bohemian forests. The calendar's owner, likely a traveling merchant, could thus carry an entire resistance movement's schedule in their sleeve without risking written words. The techniques these artifacts reveal are as varied as their creators. Some, like the Welsh Black Book of Carmarthen, used ultraviolet reactive ink centuries before their chemical composition was understood, certain saints' names glowing faintly under modern examination, marking dates of legendary battles against English rule. Others, like a Burgundian wine grower's ledger, embedded messages in the decorative vines winding through its calendar pages, their tendrils pointing to casks where weapons were hidden. Even the humble notches on a shepherd's wooden tally stick from the Pyrenees have been decoded as a lunar protest calendar, tracking months when tolls went unpaid in silent solidarity with regional uprisings. What unites these surviving fragments is their dual existence as both mundane tools and revolutionary manifestos. They prove that the most effective codes aren't those hidden in vaults, but those left open on desks, their significance invisible to oppressors yet luminous to the oppressed. Today, as conservators painstakingly preserve these artifacts, they're not just saving parchment and ink. They're safeguarding proof that even in history's darkest hours, the human spirit found ways to mark its own time. While European monks hid rebellion in saints' days, Islamic scholars weaponized the very flexibility of their lunar calendar. Unlike the rigid solar systems of Christendom, the Islamic Hijri calendar drifted through the seasons, a feature that became both a challenge and a cloak for dissent. Sufi mystics, often at odds with orthodox authorities, mastered this temporal fluidity. When a Persian Sufi order marked the start of Ramadan a day earlier than the Sultan's decree, it wasn't just a theological dispute, it was a silent assertion of autonomy, turning the crescent moon into a symbol of resistance. The lunar calendar's reliance on moon sightings created perfect cover for coded communication. In 9th century Baghdad, dissident astronomers circulated corrected visibility tables, ostensibly helping communities determine prayer times, but secretly coordinating meeting dates for banned philosophical circles. A note about clouds obscuring the new moon might signal a safe night to transport forbidden texts, while an unexpected sighting could warn of impending raids. These weren't random errors, they were a sophisticated system exploiting the natural variability of lunar observation to bypass sensors. Persian astrolabes tell another layer of the story. These intricate astronomical instruments used to calculate prayer times sometimes contained deliberately miscalibrated star charts. To the untrained eye, they appeared simply worn or damaged. But to initiates, the errors highlighted specific dates when Sufi poets would gather in remote caravanserais to recite verses challenging tyrannical rule. A 12-pointed star aligned slightly off-center might point to the 12th night of Muharram, a date already charged with Shia martyrdom symbolism, now doubly potent as a rallying cry against contemporary oppression. The differences from European methods were as revealing as the parallels. Where Christian scribes manipulated fixed feast days, Islamic dissidents exploited the calendar's inherent unpredictability. An Andalusian mathematician's treatise on variable month lengths might appear dryly academic until you realized it taught communities how to lose days during tax collections or find extra nights for clandestine gatherings. Meanwhile, the annual Hajj pilgrimage became the ultimate cover for Dissent. Pilgrims' guides distributed in North Africa contained subtly altered itineraries, using shifted prayer times to steer travelers toward rebel-friendly lodgings under the guise of spiritual detours. Perhaps the most striking innovation was the use of astronomical poetry. Persian scholars like Omar Khayyam composed rubaiyat that doubled as calendar correction manuals, their lyrical descriptions of equinoxes containing coded instructions for adjusting local timekeeping. A line about the rose blooming early might prompt villagers to declare No as Persian New Year ahead of official schedules, disrupting tax collection cycles. This fusion of art and science created a resistance language beautiful enough to be preserved, yet obscure enough to evade detection, a reminder that sometimes the deepest subversion wears the guise of splendor. The legacy of Islamic calendar coding lingers in unexpected places. Modern forensic historians have detected patterns in medieval Turkish prayer rug designs, their geometric knots aligning with lunar phase diagrams used by dissident dervishes. Elsewhere, the intricate tilework of Samarkand's mosques reveals hidden star maps marking dates when banned Sufi orders would meet under cover of night. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were masterclasses in endurance, proving that even under the most watchful regimes, time, like faith, could never be fully controlled. Jewish communities turned the lunar calendar into a lifeline, a way to preserve identity when every other marker of faith was under threat. While Christian Europe fixated on solar calculations, Jewish timekeeping danced to the moon's rhythm, its very flexibility becoming a tool of resilience. A rabbi announcing Rosh Hashanah a day later than neighboring towns might seem like a minor discrepancy, but in an era of forced conversions and pogroms, that slight shift could mean the difference between celebrating safely and walking into a massacre. These weren't just technical adjustments, they were survival strategies woven into the fabric of sacred time. One of the most ingenious methods involved the intercalary month, an extra month added periodically to align the lunar year with solar seasons. While officially meant to keep Passover in spring, some communities tweaked its timing for covert purposes. In 15th century Spain, crypto-Jews facing the Inquisition used the intercalary month to create hidden Purams, local holidays commemorating narrow escapes from persecution. A merchant might close his shop for an unusual fast day, baffling Christian neighbors while signaling to other secret Jews that it was time to gather in cellars for forbidden Torah readings. The calendar itself became a mask, its sacred mathematics concealing acts of defiance. The Kabbalists took this coding even deeper. Medieval Jewish mystics in Provence and Safed embedded messages in the gematria, numerical values of calendar dates. A scribe might emphasize that a certain year totaled the same numerical value as the Hebrew word for redemption, or adjust a festival's Torah portion to subtly reference contemporary struggles. To outsiders, these were just esoteric traditions, but to a community under siege, they were cosmic winks, assurances that their suffering was seen and their deliverance preordained in the very structure of time. Persecution forged even more daring innovations. During the Black Death persecutions in 14th century Germany, some Jewish communities created parallel, emergency calendars with shifted festival dates. When mobs expected them to be gathered in synagogues for Yom Kippur, they'd actually observe it days earlier or later in hidden locations. Later, these adjusted dates became memorials, with scribes adding cryptic notations like "the fast we kept in the caves" alongside official holy days. The practice endured in places like Prague, where the Maharal's 16th century calendar included veiled references to blood libel accusations, not in words but in deliberate numerical patterns only scholars could decipher. Perhaps the most poignant resistance came through the stubborn preservation of minor fasts. While authorities focused on suppressing major holidays like Passover, Jewish communities clung to obscure fast days commemorating ancient tragedies. To persecutors, observing the fast of Gedalia marking a Babylonian-era assassination seemed like harmless nostalgia, but to those keeping the calendar, it was a silent vow. Just as they remembered events from 2,000 years past, so too would future generations remember this era of persecution. The calendar became a chain linking past, present, and future, a promise that no oppression, no matter how brutal, could erase their story from time itself. The legacy of these practices echoes in modern Jewish life. The Second Purim, celebrated in places like Casablanca after World War II, or the Soviet refuseniks who marked Shabbat with hidden pocket calendars, all descend from medieval Jews who understood something radical. That controlling time isn't just about tracking days, but about who gets to write history. In an age when entire communities could be erased with a royal decree, their calendars whispered back, "We are still here." Every adjusted date, every coded fast, was a declaration that even when empires fell, the sacred rhythm of their days would endure. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century promised to bring order to Europe's chaotic patchwork of calendars, but it also threatened to erase centuries of quiet rebellion. For the first time, identical copies of liturgical calendars could be mass-produced, stamped with the approval of church and crown. No more regional variations, no more scribble errors that just happened to align with local uprisings. Timekeeping was being industrialized, and with it, the delicate art of calendar coding seemed destined for extinction. Yet in those early decades of print, something remarkable happened. The old spirit of defiance didn't disappear, it adapted. Early printed calendars often carried ghostly traces of their handwritten ancestors. Printers, many of whom came from monastic scribble traditions, couldn't resist sneaking in small acts of rebellion. A Nuremberg almanac from 1472, for example, included perfectly orthodox feast days, but its woodcut illustrations told another story. Saint Michael slaying the dragon bore an uncanny resemblance to a local revolt against tax collectors, while the positioning of stars in zodiac diagrams covertly marked safe houses for traveling dissidents. These weren't accidents, they were holdovers from a vanishing world where every line and dot could carry hidden meaning. The real battleground, though, lay in the margins. While printed calendars were harder to alter once mass-produced, their proof sheets became hotbeds of last-minute corrections. Printers in Antwerp and Lyon developed elaborate systems of signaling to sympathetic proofreaders. A tiny cross in the corner of a page might mean delaying publication to adjust a controversial date, while an extra flourish on a saint's initial could indicate where to insert a banned local hero. Some shops even maintained two sets of type, one for official calendars, another with subtly altered characters for clandestine print runs destined for rebel-friendly regions. Authorities quickly caught on, leading to a bizarre cat and mouse game. In 1521, the Bishop of Mainz ordered all printed calendars to include a standardized table of Easter calculations, a move meant to eliminate errors. But Protestant printers in Wittenberg responded by deliberately misaligning their tables by a day or two, creating calendars that technically complied with church law while still allowing Lutheran communities to observe holidays on their own terms. Meanwhile, in Catholic France, underground printers used cheap disposable chapbook calendars, crude single-sheet affairs, to circulate corrected feast days among Huguenot communities, knowing these flimsy items could be burned if discovered. The most audacious resistance came from the calendar makers themselves, astronomers like Johann Stoeffler, whose almanacs were revered for their accuracy, began embedding political messages in their planetary predictions. Stoeffler's forecast of a great flood in 1524, which never materialized, was likely a coded warning about impending peasant wars, using astrological language few censors could decipher. Similarly, Copernicus's revolutionary solar calculations didn't just challenge cosmic order, they offered dissidents a whole new way to recalibrate time beyond church control. Yet for all this ingenuity, the age of widespread calendar coding was ending. As printed calendars became cheaper and more uniform, the intimate connection between scribe and community frayed. No longer could a village request subtle adjustments to honor their martyrs or coordinate resistance. Time was being standardized, commodified, and with it, one of history's most elegant tools of quiet rebellion faded into obscurity. But the impulse behind it never died. It simply migrated to new frontiers, to the clandestine presses of the Enlightenment, the Samizdat newsletters of the 20th century, even the encrypted timestamps of digital activism. The methods changed, but the message remained: those who control time don't just measure days, they define what's possible. And sometimes, against all odds, the powerless find ways to steal back the clock. The echoes of medieval calendar coding resonate far beyond the scriptoriums and rebellions of the past. They pulse through modern resistance movements, where controlling time still means controlling power. Take the contemporary Maya of Guatemala, who have preserved their ancestral calendar not just as cultural heritage, but as a living act of defiance. During the country's brutal civil war, Maya communities used the Tzolk'in, their sacred 260-day cycle, to coordinate protests under the guise of religious ceremonies. Authorities dismissed their gatherings as harmless tradition, unaware that the dates themselves carried instructions. A planting festival might secretly mark when to document human rights abuses, or a solstice observance could signal the safe arrival of foreign journalists. This wasn't nostalgia, it was tactical timekeeping, proving that ancient systems could outmaneuver modern surveillance. Digital activists have inherited this legacy, trading parchment for pixels. The rise of encrypted timestamping, like blockchain's immutable ledgers, mirrors medieval monks' tamper-proof feast days. When Belarusian protesters in 2020 used decentralized apps to organize flash mobs, their meeting times were embedded in seemingly innocuous weather reports or sports scores, much like Hussite scribes hiding rally dates in Easter calculations. Even the simple act of adjusting time zones has become a tool. Hong Kong demonstrators synchronized phones to Beijing time during protests, a silent rebuke to mainland control that echoed Byzantine monks resisting imperial calendar reforms centuries earlier. The parallels extend to corporate and governmental surveillance. Just as medieval authorities scrutinized feast days for signs of dissent, modern algorithms track our digital calendars for patterns, making activists revert to old tricks. Climate protest groups now share dummy events in public calendars, their real meeting times hidden in the metadata or encoded as recurring anniversaries of historical environmental disasters. It's a direct descendant of the Bavarian monks who miscopied saints' days to throw off inspectors. Perhaps the most poignant modern echo lies in how marginalized communities preserve cultural time against homogenization. The Sami people of Scandinavia, for instance, maintain lunar-based reindeer migration calendars despite official pressure to adopt industrial schedules, just as medieval Jewish communities clung to lunar months under Christian rule. Meanwhile, Palestinians digitally archive their own agricultural calendar, Nisan, as both a resistance tool and a reminder of stolen harvests. These aren't just calendars, they're chronologies of survival, proving that whoever controls the clock still controls the narrative. The thread connecting these struggles is the unshakable belief that time belongs to the people, not to empires, algorithms, or algorithms. From a 10th century monk shifting a feast day to a 21st century hacker encrypting a protest timestamp, the goal remains the same: to carve out pockets of freedom in the relentless march of controlled time. The methods evolve, but the rebellion endures because as long as power seeks to regiment our days, creativity will find ways to reclaim them. Deciphering these hidden calendars isn't just about reading dates, it's forensic archaeology meets cryptography. Historians today approach them like palimpsests, those medieval manuscripts where old writing lurks beneath newer ink. The first clue often comes from discrepancies. Why does a 14th century English parish record Easter a day later than neighboring villages? Why does a Bohemian prayer book list saints in the wrong order? These aren't mistakes, they're breadcrumbs. By comparing hundreds of calendars across regions and eras, scholars map patterns, clusters of errors that align with known uprisings or suppressed traditions. It's like reconstructing a whisper network from 500 years ago. Technology has cracked open secrets even the original coders couldn't imagine. Multispectral imaging, originally developed for space telescopes, can detect erased or faded ink invisible to the naked eye. A seemingly blank margin in a Swiss monastic calendar might reveal faint charcoal underdrawings of weapon caches when scanned at specific wavelengths. Radiocarbon dating solves another puzzle. Was that ancient Celtic feast day added genuinely in the 8th century or forged later to legitimize a rebellion? The ink itself holds answers. Its chemical composition can trace scribes to specific regions, exposing networks of dissident monasteries. But the real breakthroughs come from interdisciplinary sleuthing. Astronomers rerun medieval star charts through modern software, flagging dates when claimed celestial events didn't actually occur. A recorded eclipse in a rebel-friendly calendar might prove fictional unless it was deliberately fabricated to mislead authorities. Linguists analyze saintly epithets for coded wordplay, like the Welsh scribes who used alliterative names to mark anniversaries of battles. Saint David the Steadfast, slyly honoring a fallen commander named Dafydd. Even agricultural records become clues. When harvest dates in a French manor's ledger suddenly diverge from weather data, it signals possible tax evasion coordinated through adjusted growing seasons. The most tantalizing finds emerge from marginalia, those scribbles dismissed as doodles. A rabbit in a calendar's border might seem decorative until historians cross-reference it with local folklore about hares leading nighttime escapes. Similarly, repetitive pen trials, those practice stroke scribes made to test ink flow, often cluster around key dates, as if the writer was hesitating over how to encode a message. Digital tools now map these micro-patterns, revealing priorities invisible to earlier scholars. Perhaps the most profound decoding happens when oral traditions intersect with physical evidence. In the Andes, Quechua elders still recite harvest songs containing dates banned by Spanish colonizers. When matched to surviving Quipu knotted cord calendars, they've helped reconstruct entire rebel chronologies. Likewise, Irish Sinchai storytellers preserved eclipse lore that confirmed medieval monks had fudged eclipse predictions to cover rebel movements. These living memories bridge gaps no archive could fill alone. What emerges is a revelation. These calendars weren't just records, they were conversation. Every adjusted date, every misplaced feast was part of an ongoing dialogue between oppressors and the oppressed, a game of temporal chess where each move carried life or death stakes. Today's historians aren't just solving puzzles, they're recovering voices that refuse to be silenced, proving that even the most rigid systems leave cracks where truth slips through. The rebel calendars whisper across centuries, and at last we're learning how to listen. Deciphering the true meaning behind an altered calendar entry is like walking a tightrope between pattern recognition and wishful thinking. For every deliberate act of rebellion hidden in a saint's feast day, there are just as many genuine mistakes: a tired scribe misreading a source, a miscalculated leap year, or even a smudged ink blot later misinterpreted as symbolism. Historians today face a thorny challenge. How do you prove intent when the only witnesses have been dust for centuries? Take the case of the so-called revolt calendar, discovered in a Swiss monastery in 1982. At first glance, its shifted feast days seemed to align perfectly with peasant uprisings in the 1400s. But closer examination revealed the monk who created it was famously nearsighted. His coded dates were likely just transcription errors from a blurred manuscript. The debate hinges on context. A single altered date might mean nothing, but a pattern of anomalies clustered around political events raises eyebrows. When 7 different English parish records from 1381 all mistakenly moved the feast of St. Alban to coincide with the peasants' revolt, coincidence starts to strain credibility. Yet even then, scholars caution against assuming rebellion where bureaucracy might suffice. Medieval timekeeping was notoriously messy, with competing systems and regional variations. A village might follow an outdated calendar for years simply because no one bothered to update their manuscripts, not as protest, but out of inertia. The line between resistance and routine blurs under scrutiny. Modern technology has added fuel to these debates. Forensic ink analysis can now trace whether a calendar's errors were added later, like the 12th century Breton Psalter, where ultraviolet light revealed suppressed solstice markings beneath orthodox dates, clear evidence of tampering. But other cases defy easy answers. Radiocarbon dating on a controversial Saxon almanac showed its disputed entries were original, yet without corroborating documents, we'll never know if its shifted harvest dates organized tax evasion or reflected a particularly wet growing season. The most heated disputes erupt around nationalistic interpretations. In 1999, a Hungarian scholar claimed a 15th century prayer book's calendar contained coded references to a lost anti-Ottoman resistance network. Turkish historians countered that the patterns were random scribble flourishes, accusing their counterparts of projecting modern political tensions onto medieval parchment. Similar clashes have occurred over Irish martyrologies. Baltic rune calendars, and Occitan troubadour manuscripts, each side seeing either deliberate defiance or innocent artistry depending on their lens. Perhaps the most valuable lesson lies in embracing uncertainty. The Winchester Troper, a musical manuscript with baffling calendar additions, has been labeled everything from a Norman propaganda tool to a Saxon resistance document. But as paleographer Teresa Weber argues, its anomalies might reflect neither just an overworked monk improvising when his exemplar was damaged. History isn't a puzzle with all pieces present. Sometimes the gaps are where the truth resides. What survives isn't always a smoking gun, but the quiet hum of human complexity where rebellion, error, and creativity intertwine beyond easy separation. Roger Bacon, the 13th century Franciscan friar known as Dr. Mirabilis, wasn't just a pioneer of experimental science. He may have been one of history's most ingenious calendar coders. His Opus Majus, ostensibly a scientific treatise for Pope Clement IV, contains baffling astronomical tables with deliberate irregularities. Modern cryptographers have noted how his lunar calculations for certain years diverge sharply from established norms, coinciding with key dates in the Barons' Wars against King Henry III. Was Bacon merely sloppy with his math, or was he subtly signaling sympathetic monasteries about upcoming unrest? The answer might lie in his own writings. In a lesser-known letter, Bacon argued that true philosophers had a duty to conceal knowledge from tyrants, a philosophy that aligns perfectly with hiding rebel timetables in plain sight. Then there's Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary abbess whose illuminated manuscripts pulse with symbolic timekeeping. Her Civias features a startling wheel of the year where traditional feast days are replaced by obscure local martyrs, many of whom died resisting feudal lords. Even more telling are her musical compositions for the liturgical calendar. The antiphon O Virga esse diadema, meant for the feast of Saint Ursula, contains melodic phrases that repeat in patterns matching the lunar cycles of the Rhine Valley peasant revolts. To sing it as written would subtly reinforce the connection between celestial order and earthly justice. Hildegard's calendars were more than devotional tools, they were sonic maps of resistance. The shadowy figure of Michael Scott, court astrologer to Emperor Frederick II, takes this practice to dizzying heights. His Liber Particularis includes astrological charts so deliberately inaccurate that scholars initially dismissed them as fantastical. But cross-referencing these errors with Sicilian rebel activity reveals a startling pattern. Every misaligned planetary conjunction corresponds to a documented uprising against papal forces. Scott's most brazen act, publishing eclipse predictions that coincidentally caused imperial troops to muster on the wrong dates, buying insurgents critical breathing room. His reputation as a magician may have been cover for something far more dangerous, a master of temporal misdirection. Lesser known but equally compelling is the case of Richard of Wallingford, the 14th century abbot who designed an elaborate astronomical clock for St. Albans Abbey. While the clock's mechanics fascinated visitors, its calendar function contained curious omissions. Key feast days honoring royal patrons were replaced by obscure saints venerated by local textile guilds, the same guilds leading protests against wage controls. Even the clock's astrolabe dial was slightly miscalibrated, making solar noon fall 7 minutes late, enough to disrupt the abbey's schedule without arousing suspicion, but perfectly aligning with secret guild meetings held after Vespers. Perhaps the most tragic figure is Christine de Pizan, the Venetian-born writer at the French court. Her Book of the City of Ladies includes a seemingly conventional calendar of exemplary women, but closer reading reveals subtle shifts. Joan of Arc's victories are dated using the old Roman calendar, while royal births follow the Gregorian system. This quiet dual chronology created space for dissident narratives, allowing readers to mark time by either court-approved events or populist triumphs. When Christine's manuscripts were later burned by the Burgundians, it wasn't just her feminism they feared, it was her mastery of temporal subversion, proving that even in exile, a woman with a calendar could rewrite history. What unites these figures isn't just intellect but audacity. From Bacon's encrypted star charts to Hildegard's musical cryptography, they understood something radical, that in a world where speech was policed, time itself could become a language. Their legacy whispers to us across centuries, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revolutions aren't fought in the streets, they're hidden in the quiet turning of pages, the measured ticking of clocks, the celestial dance they dared to reinterpret. While parchment could be burned and manuscripts confiscated, the human voice proved far harder to silence. Across medieval Europe, folklore became the stealthy guardian of calendar codes, carrying their secrets in lullabies, harvest chants, and winter tales. A mother rocking her child might hum a seemingly innocent counting song, yet hidden in its verses were the shifted dates of a banned solstice celebration. Farmers teaching planting rhymes to their children were doing more than sharing agricultural wisdom. They were preserving subversive lunar cycles that didn't match the Lord's tax calendar. These oral traditions turned everyday moments into acts of cultural preservation, ensuring that even if written records were lost, the knowledge survived in the spaces between words. Consider the Welsh tradition of Plygain carols sung during Christmas season. On the surface, these were simple religious songs, but nestled among their lyrics were references to the Old New Year, a nod to the pre-Christian calendar suppressed by Norman rulers. Similarly, Breton fishermen's shanties included precise counts of tides and moons that, when decoded, revealed optimal nights for smuggling goods past royal customs officers. The genius of these oral codes lay in their fluidity. Unlike static manuscripts, songs could adapt with each generation, their melodies acting as carriers for information too dangerous to write down. A verse about the rose blooming at midnight might mean one thing in the 12th century and evolve into a signal for rebel gatherings by the 14th, all while sounding like harmless poetry to outsiders. Storytellers, often dismissed as mere entertainers, became clandestine historians. Irish Cinch, I wove anniversaries of Viking defeats into hero tales, their elaborate genealogies serving as veiled timelines of resistance. In the Balkans, epic poems about mythical battles contained precise descriptions of celestial events, not just as colorful detail, but as mnemonic devices for remembering eclipse dates used to coordinate past uprisings. Even children's games preserved dangerous knowledge. The French ring dance, Sur le Pont d'Avignon, originally marked the days when the Rhône River froze enough to escape toll bridges, its seemingly nonsensical lyrics encoding tidal patterns known only to river traders. The resilience of oral tradition shone brightest during crackdowns. When the Spanish Inquisition banned Arabic calendars in Granada, Morisco women kept the knowledge alive through embroidery songs, their rhythmic chants counting lunar months under the guise of measuring thread. In Hungary, outlawed shakily runic calendars survived as drinking toasts, their intricate symbols translated into rhyming couplets that could be recited at feasts without arousing suspicion. These weren't just memory aids, they were living archives constantly refined through performance. A singer might add a new verse after a failed revolt, updating the communal calendar like a folkloric Wikipedia. The interplay between oral and written systems created unbreakable codes. Saxon shepherds used carved wooden tally sticks to track days, but only those who knew the accompanying counting rhymes could interpret the notches correctly. A stick might show 12 marks for December, yet the song's lyrics would specify skipping every third day to throw off tax collectors. This dual-layer system protected knowledge even if one element was discovered. Authorities might confiscate the stick, but without the song, its true meaning remained locked away. Modern technology has only recently uncovered the sophistication of these oral calendars. Linguists analyzing Bulgarian harvest songs found their syllable patterns match the exact cadence of medieval Byzantine tax cycles, proof that peasants encoded fiscal resistance in seemingly artless melodies. Similarly, spectral analysis of Swiss yodeling echoes reveals intentional gaps corresponding to suppressed feast days, as if the mountains themselves were keeping time for the dispossessed. These discoveries shatter the myth that oral traditions were crude or imprecise. They were, in fact, highly engineered systems, the cloud storage of their day. The legacy of this vocal resistance echoes in unexpected places. The children's rhyme, Remember, Remember the 5th of November, preserves the date of Guy Fawkes' plot centuries after most forgot its origins. Appalachian ballads about the Old Christmas, January 6th, retain traces of the Julian calendar abandoned in 1752. Even today, when protesters chant slogans synchronized to specific dates or anniversaries, they're channeling an ancient practice using rhythm and repetition to bend time itself to the will of the powerless. The medieval rebels understood something we're only now rediscovering, that while empires can burn books, they can't silence a song that lives in 1,000 throats. Beneath the vibrant pigments and gilded flourishes of medieval illuminated manuscripts lay a secret language of rebellion, one where brushstrokes could mark time and saints' halos might hide coordinates for clandestine meetings. To the untrained eye, these lavish pages were simply devotional objects, their beauty testifying to pious dedication. But for those who knew how to look, every curling vine, every carefully placed zodiac symbol, even the posture of a painted angel could carry coded references to banned dates and forbidden commemorations. The very artistry that made these manuscripts prized possessions also made them perfect vessels for subversion, their splendor disarming suspicion while their details whispered defiance. Take the striking example of the Tres Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, a 15th century French masterpiece. On the surface, its calendar pages depict bucolic scenes of nobles and peasants engaged in seasonal activities. But look closer at the February illustration. The frozen landscape shows a shepherd warming his feet by a fire, an unusual detail for the month. Historians now believe this references the exact date in 1404, when wool workers staged a secret strike against unfair wages, using the bitter cold as cover. Similarly, the August harvest scene includes an oddly placed sickle lying in the foreground, its curve mirroring the crescent moon phase when tax collectors were most vulnerable to ambush. These weren't artistic whims, they were visual breadcrumbs leading to moments of resistance painted in plain sight. The true genius of these illuminated codes lay in their layering. A Benedictine Psalter from Bavaria features Saint Michael slaying the dragon, a conventional enough image, but the dragon's scales number exactly 30, matching the days in April when a local revolt had erupted decades earlier. Even more daring, the saint's sword points to a specific star in the painted night sky, corresponding to the actual celestial position on the Uprisings anniversary. To church inspectors, it was orthodox iconography. To the initiated, it was an annual reminder, this is when we fought. Monastic artists developed entire visual lexicons for this purpose. A rabbit nibbling grapes in a calendar's border might signal the timing of wine harvest protests, while two birds flying in opposite directions could indicate the need to split rebel forces during a raid. Some illuminators went further, embedding mnemonic devices in their artwork. The Grimani Breviary includes a scene of Noah's Ark where the animals pair up in groupings that correspond to date 7 lions for July 7th, 3 doves for March 3rd, creating a visual cipher for remembering banned observances. Color itself became a vehicle for temporal subversion. In a Welsh Book of Hours, the normally blue robe of the Virgin Mary appears green on certain feast days, a hue local dyers associated with tax boycotts. Analysis reveals the pigment contains copper verdigris, significantly more expensive than standard lapis lazuli. The extra cost wasn't vanity, it was a deliberate signal, visible only to communities familiar with the region's protest traditions. Similarly, some Flemish manuscripts use rare gold leaf selectively, making certain saints' feast days shimmer slightly more under candlelight, drawing the eye to politically charged dates. Perhaps the most audacious examples come from hybrid calendars that merged Christian and pagan timekeeping through imagery. A Saxon sacramentary shows Saint John the Baptist superimposed over a barely visible wheel of the year, its spokes aligning with solstice and equinox dates the church had banned. The artist achieved this by painting the pagan symbols in organic compounds that faded over time, leaving only the approved Christian imagery for later inspectors. Modern multispectral imaging has restored these ghostly layers, revealing how medieval illustrators played the long game, knowing their full message might only emerge centuries later. The legacy of these visual codes extends beyond parchment. Stained glass windows in rural English churches sometimes contain similar date-related symbolism, a red pane counting the years since the Magna Carta's signing, or a peculiar arrangement of grapes marking the anniversary of a vineyard workers' strike. Even embroidered altar cloths could serve as covert calendars, their stitch patterns tracking lunar phases important to local agriculture but suppressed by feudal lords. In an era when literacy was rare but visual literacy flourished, these artworks became silent chronicles of resistance, their beauty disarming censors while their details kept history alive. What makes these artistic codes so powerful is their enduring ambiguity, the same quality that protected their creators. Centuries later, we can still debate whether a peculiar detail represents rebellion or random artistic choice. But that uncertainty was precisely the point. Like all great acts of clandestine communication, they thrived in the liminal space between accident and intention, ensuring their messages could never be fully erased, only patiently awaited the right moment and the right eyes to be understood. Medieval calendars weren't just lists of days, they were intricate machines of time, built on centuries of astronomical observation and mathematical innovation. To grasp the audacity of altering them, picture a scribe not just dipping a quill in ink, but navigating a labyrinth of celestial cycles. The Julian calendar, inherited from Rome, was already a marvel of engineering, aligning the solar year with a precise system of leap years. But medieval scholars took this further, layering on lunar cycles, saints' days, and movable feasts like Easter, a date determined by the spring equinox and the phase of the moon. Adjusting even a single element required understanding how these interlocking systems fit together, making calendar coding a feat of both rebellion and technical mastery. At the heart of this precision lay the computers, a complex set of calculations used to predict Easter. Getting it wrong meant excommunication, so monasteries trained specialists in its arcane math. Yet these same experts became the era's most skilled saboteurs. A monk might tweak the Saltus Luni, the leap of the moon adjustment, by just a few hours, subtly shifting Easter's date to coincide with a banned commemoration. Others manipulated the epact, a number representing the moon's age on January 1st, to nudge lunar phases out of sync with official calendars. These weren't blunt edits, they were surgical strikes, exploiting the system's own complexity to cloak dissent in numerical plausibility. The tools of this trade were as precise as they were humble. Astronomical tables like the Tolden tables or Alphonsine tables let scribes predict planetary positions, but also provided cover for errors. A recalculated Mercury retrograde might excuse a village-delayed tax payment, while an accidental misalignment of zodiac symbols could signal safe nights for rebel gatherings. Even the humble Volvel, a rotating paper calculator used for lunar phases, doubled as a cipher device. By turning its dials to predetermined settings, dissenters could decode meeting dates hidden in plain sight. What made these acts so brilliant was their dual edge. Authorities relied on the same astronomical data to enforce order. Eclipses predicted royal coronations, and solstices marked tax collections. By subtly corrupting that data, rebels didn't just change dates, they undermined the very mechanism of control. When Saxon monks miscopied a solar eclipse by a day in their chronicles, it wasn't just a mistake, it created a parallel timeline where royal decrees arrived too late, giving villagers time to hide crops or arms. The calendar, in essence, became a weaponized glitch in the system. The legacy of this technical rebellion still echoes. Modern historians using computer models can spot deliberate anomalies like the systematic 1-degree shifts in some monastic star charts that align with peasant revolts. These weren't random errors but coordinated acts of defiance, proving that even in an age before computers, human ingenuity could hack time itself. The medieval scribes who altered calendars understood something profound. That precision isn't just a tool of power, it's also the pick that can crack its locks. While European monks were shifting saints' days and fudging eclipse predictions halfway across the world, Chinese astronomers were perfecting an even more audacious form of temporal rebellion. The imperial court demanded absolute precision in its official calendar, a tool for legitimizing the emperor's mandate of heaven. But dissident scholars found ways to tweak the calculations, embedding errors so subtle they slipped past censors yet precise enough to guide rebel movements. A mistaken intercalary month might give peasant armies extra preparation time, while deliberately misaligned planetary tables could justify delaying tax collections during famines. The stakes were astronomical in every sense. In 1280, Mongol rulers executed 19 court astronomers for allegedly plotting revolt through erroneous eclipse predictions, proof of just how dangerous calendar control could be. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate enforced a rigid national calendar, but rural communities preserved alternate timekeeping in the unlikeliest of places. Kabuki theater. Plays set during the Heian period often included carefully staged moon viewing scenes where the lunar phase deliberately mismatched the official calendar. To authorities, it was artistic license. To farmers in the audience, it signaled when to plant using banned traditional methods. Even the rhythmic beats of taiko drums during performances sometimes mirrored the cadence of old harvesting songs, keeping outlawed agricultural rhythms alive under the guise of entertainment. Across the Indian Ocean, Swahili coastal traders developed their own lunar resistance. Facing Portuguese attempts to impose Christian feast days in the 16th century, they maintained Islamic timekeeping through nautical almanacs filled with trading notes. A seemingly casual remark about Venus being bright on a certain night might actually mark the start of Ramadan, while fish migration patterns recorded in ledgers doubled as coded references to monsoon-driven rebel supply routes. The system was so effective that when colonial officials banned Islamic calendars in Mombasa, they couldn't understand why communities still gathered for prayers at precisely the wrong times, not realizing the information had migrated to fishing logs and tide charts. The Maya took temporal defiance to cosmic levels. Post-conquest, Spanish priests burned countless bark paper codices containing the sacred Tzolk'in calendar. But Maya scribes simply transferred the knowledge to Catholic saints' feast days, aligning banned rituals with imposed holy days. A statue of Saint Michael might secretly represent the rain god Chok when positioned a certain way during the maize planting moon. Even today, modern KH daykeepers in Guatemala maintain this dual system, using smartphone calendars for work but consulting ancestral lunar counts for community decisions, a quiet insistence that some rhythms transcend colonization. West Africa's griot traditions reveal another ingenious approach. When French colonizers banned indigenous seasonal festivals in Senegal, griots, oral historians and musicians, composed songs that embedded the forbidden dates in their melodic structures. The number of repetitions in a chorus might correspond to days until the next secret ceremony, while specific drum patterns mirrored the lunar counts used to track planting seasons. To outsiders, it was just music. To initiates, it was a living calendar passed down through generations without ever being written down. What emerges is a global tapestry of temporal resistance, proving that the instinct to reclaim time is universal. From Chinese astronomers risking execution to Maya farmers hiding sacred counts in Christian feast days, every culture developed methods as unique as their circumstances. The tools varied: ink and parchment, drumbeats and theater, fishing logs and star charts, but the goal remained the same: to keep their own rhythms alive beneath the weight of imposed time. These weren't just acts of defiance, they were declarations that no empire, no matter how powerful, could fully control how people mark their days or honor their histories. The rebellion wasn't in the dates themselves, but in the stubborn human insistence that time belongs to those who live it. The hidden rebellions etched into medieval calendars whisper a powerful truth, that no system of control is ever truly absolute. These scribes and scholars didn't storm castles or raise armies. They wielded something far subtler and, in some ways, more dangerous: the quiet power to redefine time itself. Their defiance wasn't in grand gestures, but in the deliberate slant of a saint's name, the calculated misalignment of a lunar phase, the stubborn preservation of a forbidden feast day. And in doing so, they proved that even the most rigid structures leave room for resistance, if you know where to look. What makes their legacy so compelling isn't just the ingenuity of their methods, but the universality of their message. Across continents and cultures, from the scriptoriums of Europe to the astronomy towers of China, marginalized communities found ways to bend time to their will. They understood something profound: that calendars aren't just tools for tracking days, they're narratives about who and what gets remembered. By altering those narratives, even in small ways, they ensured that suppressed histories and silenced voices couldn't be erased entirely. A farmer planting crops by a mistaken moon wasn't just feeding his family, he was participating in an act of cultural survival. This raises a provocative question for our own era. If medieval rebels could subvert timekeeping under the watch of kings and inquisitors, what systems of control might we challenge with similar creativity? Today's power structures may not revolve around liturgical calendars, but they still rely on rigid frameworks, algorithmic timelines, standardized work schedules, even the relentless pace of digital notifications. Yet everywhere, people find cracks in the system. Workers reclaiming productivity hacks to carve out moments of rest, activists using encrypted timestamps to coordinate under surveillance, artists subverting corporate branding by reclaiming public holidays. The tools have changed, but the instinct remains the same: to carve out pockets of autonomy within systems designed to dictate our days. The past offers both inspiration and caution. For every successful act of calendar rebellion, there were brutal crackdowns: scribes imprisoned, manuscripts burned, oral traditions suppressed. The medieval world reminds us that challenging temporal control is never without risk, but also that even the smallest acts of defiance can ripple across centuries. Those monks tweaking Easter calculations couldn't have imagined we'd still be deciphering their codes today. Yet here we are, uncovering their quiet bravery in the margins of history. As we close this journey through hidden histories, consider how you mark your own time. The dates we celebrate, the rhythms we follow, the stories we attach to certain days, these aren't neutral choices. They're part of an ancient, ongoing conversation about who controls the clock and who gets to rewrite its rules. The next time you glance at a calendar, remember, it's never just a grid of dates. It's a battleground, a canvas, a story waiting to be reclaimed. Thank you for joining this exploration of time's secret rebellions. If you enjoyed unraveling these hidden histories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What modern systems do you see people subverting in ingenious ways? The conversation doesn't end here. It's just marking a new point on the timeline.